Welcome to another March 18th, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm Energy journalist Markham Hislop. I did a show this morning with economist Chris Bataille about some of the options that Canada has for restructuring its economy in the face of the Trump tariffs and the threat from the United States. But in this episode, I'm going to be talking to political scientist Lisa Young at the University of Calgary about a Substack that she wrote that really touched my heart. And it's about the United States and about how Canadians now feel about the US. So, Lisa, welcome to the Energy Show.
I'm always happy to be here.
I've had you on the podcast many times. The first time for here. What struck me about your Substack was the story you told about going down to Washington and how it was not just the death of your relationship to the United States. You're kind of done with them, like many Canadians. I am, but the death of ideas, the death of the U.S. is something other than like the shining city on the hill. And yesterday, in the episode I did with, I won't say the title because YouTube didn't like it, but I told stories about the 5 years I spent in the U.S. working in Texas, and how the many wonderful people I met, and how distraught I am that I now don't want to ever go there again and don't want anything to do with them. And anyway, I'm rambling. Please tell us about your Substack and the story of going down to Washington.
Sure. Well, I guess, why I wrote yesterday was because there have just been enough things that have happened in the past few days that really makes me think that we have to call it on American democracy at the moment. And I teach first year political science. And so I'm in this strange position where, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I stand up in front of a couple of hundred 18 and 19-year-olds and explain to them about democracy and how political institutions work. And I, at some level, feel that I don't know how to do this anymore, right? So, what got me thinking about this, back in the fall of 2023, I had gone to a conference in Washington, and my long-suffering spouse came with me and took pictures of me, on the steps of the Supreme Court, on the steps of Congress, and as close as we could get to the White House with security. And I used them to teach my first years, right? We talk about political institutions, we talk about the separation of powers, and look, here are my vacation pics, right? So it sort of makes things come alive.
Sure.
But it was when we were there, and it was still, Biden was still in the White House, and we didn't know what was going to happen. But there was a little piece of me as we did the rounds of Washington that was, I think, saying goodbye to these institutions. I wanted to stop by each of these buildings because I knew that there was a possibility I was never going back, that what they stood for might not be meaningful or real anymore. And, I can't remember if I said it out loud, but I do know I was thinking it. And certainly now, I'm getting to the point in my course where we're about to start seeing those pictures show up. And, next week I'm going to teach about the separation of powers, and I don't know how, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Was it yesterday that Trump decided that he would not obey a court order, that he would,
Yep.
and so that then breaks the separation of powers between the Congress, the executive, and judiciary, and essentially Trump is taking to himself powers that by way the American Constitution is written, he doesn't have, shouldn't have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a lot of things going on here, but two particular pieces. The first, and this is new, is the idea that the president refuses to be constrained by judicial rulings, right? That the courts don't actually have authority over me, and that's a breakdown to some extent of the separation of powers, but also of rule of law, right? The idea that the law applies to everyone, including the president. So that, I think, was, one of the reasons that, a lot of observers yesterday said, "Oh, this is it. We've crossed over at this moment." But also what we've seen over the past, I was gonna, it feels like a year, but it's only been a month. What we've seen over the past month is um, the dynamic of the separation of powers, the idea that ambition should check ambition, that
Right.
Congress would check the president and keep the president from acting like a monarch. And it has broken down. Congress has chosen not to use the authority that it has under the Constitution to say to the president, you don't actually have the authority to do a whole bunch of the things that you are currently doing.
Lisa, let's put aside the political science for just a moment and deal with the way that we feel about this. Because I am absolutely gobsmacked by the number of Canadians who are saying, um, what Trump has done to Canada, the disrespect, the threats of annexation, the economic pressure to make us become the 51st state, is we are done with you. We are like, this is like a divorce. We don't want anything to do. If we could, we wouldn't do any any commerce with you, any trade with you. And despite the fact that so much of our country is bound up with you, we don't want you anymore. We're splitting the sheets. And what that means to Canadians who are so tightly bound by family and friends and business to the United States. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, it's such a struggle because on the one hand, there's a clear set of ideas, right? That the United States has now started to do things that I find reprehensible. Deportations of people without due process. Um, that they're, the threats about annexation of Canada, which are just utterly unacceptable in any way, shape, or form, right? All of these sorts of things. Um, when I think about the idea of crossing the border, I'm afraid, among other things, right? We're hearing stories now about border guards, and most of them probably are fine, but you know certainly things have broken down there in some ways. So there's all of that, but then there's just the extent to which our lives are just intermingled with the Americans in so many ways. So many of us have family in the United States, and so then the question becomes, do you miss out on family events because you won't cross the border?
Right now,
It's
you mentioned that your brother-in-law had married an American, and they have a couple children in Chicago, and they're sort of the marrying age. And your family's literally discussing, would we go to those weddings under the circumstances, and maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, we just, as we process all of these things, it sort of came up in conversation, and it just, it ground us to a halt, right? What would we do, right, under these sorts of circumstances? And, you know, I, I think this is not at all unusual for Canadians, right? There are all of these family ties, professional ties. People's lives have gone back and forth. And even, if we think about what we do in the evenings, right? I will read the American news because I can't turn away. I might watch some American television. It's our cultures are so intermingled, and the notion of cutting that off is just, you sort of say it in the first instance and say, oh, we're done with the Americans. And then when you actually start to think about the many ways in which our lives are mixed up together, and we really have become one community in so many ways, it's so difficult to really imagine this.
I agree wholeheartedly. And like you, I will not cross the border into the United States. And not just on principle, but because there have been a couple of Canadian journalists who have been pulled out and kept for hours and hours incommunicado. And there's even an issue, I don't know enough about it. I won't get into the details. But this, for anybody who has publicly criticized Trump and the Trump administration, you have not just second thoughts. I won't even have a thought about going across the border because what that might mean for me. Because clearly, what Trump is doing is he's paving the way so that he can punish his political enemies. He overturns Biden's pardons, and some of those people were his supporters. And he wants to go. He's even talked about Biden going after Biden for crying out loud, which is another one president going after another in that way is utterly shocking. So if some journalist from Canada who's publicly criticized him many times crosses the border, what does he care? What do the bureau, this civil servants who man the border and so what do they care? All they know is, oh, he's on a list, or I saw one of his videos, I didn't like them. Out you go, and then where are you? So I apparently the Canadian tourism into or trips into the United States are way down, and there's a very good reason for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it will be interesting to see how Canadians adjust. Right now we're in that moment of, anger about the tariffs and sort of shock about some of the things that we're seeing. But again, the pull is strong in many ways, and it will be interesting to see how this plays out over time, right? Human beings' capacity to normalize things is remarkable, and so who knows how this looks in 2 or 3 years, but certainly for a lot of us, I think this really is like nothing we've seen in our lifetime.
It's a broken trust.
Yeah.
And I mean, even our new prime minister, Mark Carney, said the other day that as he won't meet with Trump. He won't phone him. He won't take a phone call, and until he stops being disrespectful to Canada, uh, he's not going to meet or talk to him. And there were a lot of Canadians who, including myself, who applauded that. And what I'm trying to convey to if to American viewers, and about 20% of our viewers are from the United States. What I'm trying to convey to you is the emotion of this, the feeling of this. This is not just it's lovely. I'm really enjoying the political science here and the conversation around the separation of powers and so on. But this came through in your Substack. It's heartfelt. This is ripping us apart. We don't like this any more than you do, but you can only push us so far, and you've pushed us too far this time. Your president has pushed us too far, and too many of you have gone along with him. That's a big problem because we're on social media. We run into your MAGA types and many of your other, folks that don't like Canada, and there's a lot of you, and we're not happy about it. I don't know what else to say, Lisa. We've arrived at an inflection point in the history of the two countries, and that's how Canadians feel about it. Even though people like Robert Reich say, no, 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 we're going to protest, we're going to push back, we'll get it under control. We'll get him in between the guardrails, right? Referring to Trump. We don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was certainly, part of what I was writing about yesterday was to really address the way that I think some Canadians are thinking about this, that this is 4 years and it will end, right? That we just have to ride out 4 difficult years of the Trump administration. And, going back to my political science, putting that hat on, um, when a political system crosses some of these boundaries, I don't think that you can assume a return to normal. Maybe there will be one. right? I mean,
Sure.
it's difficult to know the future, but I do think, when we think about this in practical terms, there's an expectation that the midterms will come along and that the composition of Congress will change, and that will then be
Right.
a more effective check on Trump's use of executive authority. And it's possible that will happen, but we need to remember his efforts around January 6th to overturn the results of an election that he didn't like. And, he was stopped in that instance, but we're in a very different situation now. And so, would the outcome of a midterm election be meaningful? Would be the question. Is it reasonable to think that he will respect the idea of term limits, or will he find a way to have a third term? I don't know the answers to those questions, but those are questions that we have to ask. And I don't think that we can assume that this is just a short-term thing that we're riding out.
Well, here's a political science concept for you that you'll know well, the Overton window. So the Overton window is on the political spectrum from left to right. If you can think of that box that in which acceptable political discourse happens, is it in the middle with some on the left and some on the right, or has it been shifted way right up to now, and now Trump has shifted the Overton window way over to the right, to authoritarianism and other very unpleasant I mean, we talk about, white supremacy, supremacist support, and so on. But here's my point. Once you drag the Overton window that far away from the norm, it doesn't come back to the status quo. It may come back somewhat, but it won't come back to where it was before. And I think that more than anything argues for that the United States will not return to what we think of as normal politics when Trump is done, if he's done in 4 years.
Yeah, I think that, what we're seeing here is, you can think of it in terms of the Overton window, or I was going to say the erosion of norms, but that doesn't even really capture it, right? Once the executive has stepped outside the rule of law, it's anyone's question what's going to happen next, right? And there may be a return to something that looks something like normal, but anyone who has a desire to gain power and impose their will now has seen how this can be done. And unless there's some, sort of collective bipartisan return to respecting norms and respecting rule of law, it's gone, essentially.
Here's one of the questions. I have a little hypothesis about what Trump and Elon Musk have been doing with the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. And that is, so much of democracy depends on institutions, political institutions, government institutions, and both at the federal level, the national level, right down to the municipal level. Destroy those institutions and you destroy democracy, right? You can't exercise it. You can't vote properly. You can't trust the elections. Programs or government spending isn't done the way it, in an impartial manner. I mean, on and on and on and on. And so what they've done by especially with DOGE, and in particular, Trump disrespecting the judiciary, is you either erode, undermine, or completely destroy those institutions, and institutions take decades to build and get them to the point where they function properly. And and I think that he's damaged the institutions of democracy. You're the political scientist. What do you think?
Yeah, and one of the concerns that has been expressed about DOGE and what they're doing there is that Congress has the power of the purse. So Congress can say, we would like to spend $1 billion on foreign aid. And then it's the president's job, the executive's job, to go about doing that, right? And so when Musk comes in and starts closing things, firing people, he's basically saying we're going to ignore what Congress has told the administration to do, right? And this is where, I'm back to the separation of powers, that Congress has not fought back against this erosion of their authority. They've cheered it on. So they haven't had to make the decision, no, we don't want to allocate funds to, foreign aid anymore. It's just been done for them arbitrarily in all of these ways, right? And so I think that's one of the, it's an erosion of the fundamental way that the American system is supposed to work.
So if Trump is gathering power into the executive, and let's say the midterms come along and the voters of the United States elect more Democrats. Maybe the Democrats even take control of both the Senate and the House. Uh, Normally, we would think, okay, that's a break on the executive's power, right? But in this case, if the executive just decides to ignore Congress, then it doesn't matter how many Democrats and Republicans are in there because he's not going to listen to them anyway. And that breaks a fundamental principle of the Constitution and trust in that institution.
Yeah. Yeah. And it overturns the will of the people, right? They've elected people to Congress. Congress has made these decisions. The president has basically said, I'm going to ignore that. So it would be interesting to see, it may be interesting in the future to see how something like that plays out. If the Democrats were able to reclaim both houses, and that something didn't get in the way of that, right? And I think that's an important caveat because I don't think we can assume normal anymore. But if that were the case, they would then have, the authority to impeach, right? That would be a way of trying to constrain the president. But what kind of an institutional showdown do you then end up in? Again, I don't think we can assume that normal rules would apply. So, there are a lot of question marks. These are scenarios that we don't know the answers to. The point I was trying to make in my Substack, though, is that we can't assume that our understanding of how these institutions work, about how American democracy works, that those hold anymore. We're in new, uncharted territory.
Here's an uncharted territory that Chris Bataille brought up this morning, and he said he was talking about investment and the difference between the U.S. and Canada, and the rule of law is foundational to capital investment because if you don't know that if you can't challenge a contract in court or if you can't if their government acts arbitrarily and you can't challenge it under the rule of law then capital will simply not invest. Capital will invest someplace where it has more institutional and political and legal protection. And he made the point that Canada has a very strong sense of rule of law. That's baked into the system. It works really well, and there's no question that the rule of law is alive and well and healthy in Canada. We're talking to you, Silicon Valley. Come on up. Because you can't trust, well, I guess I shouldn't say that. The tech bros were some of the folks that put Trump in. But it's the principle. It's the
Yeah.
principle that maybe Canada becomes like a safe haven where capital comes because it's safer.
I think, as long as Canada is able to retain its sovereignty and its distinctiveness from the United States, we do have advantages. And, certainly, stability, rule of law, that comes to mind. I think we can look at other things, a reasonable degree of acceptance of science. So if we look at what's going on with funding for scientific research in the United States, it's a horror show. In the academic world, screenshots are circulating of offers of admission to PhD programs being rescinded because the funding is gone, people's scientific funding being cut for political reasons or just no reason at all, right? And now the sort of the war on the elite universities. And so you can look at this and some of what's going on, the questioning of vaccines and so on. And I look at that and I think, okay, we've got a pharmaceutical industry in Canada, based in Quebec in particular. Is this not an opportunity to scoop up talented scientists and get companies to relocate to a place where scientific research will be able to continue, where they can, expect not to be persecuted for doing vaccine research, these sorts of things? There are opportunities. The dilemma, I think, for Canada is that there are all of a sudden so many opportunities at a time when we don't feel like we've got spare money. And so we're going to have to pick and choose and be strategic.
And not only that, spare money, but security.
Yeah.
Because of the threats of annexation, the threats of invasion.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the point I was making yesterday in my column is that the deep integration of the two economies, and then my area is energy, so I'm talking oil, gas, and electricity. The deep integration is a symbiotic relationship. And if one is vulnerable, the other is vulnerable. And I argued that in this particular case, it's not the supplier of the resource, it's the customer of the resource that is in fact more vulnerable. Because, I had an electrical engineer on on the weekend, and he said, well, yeah, BC and Quebec could like flick the switch and, large parts of the American economy lose a bunch of electricity, which then maybe crashes their grid, and it's chaos. It's chaos down there. And you cut off the oil. And, how's the Midwest going to, suddenly Detroiters and Chicago residents don't have gas for their cars, and on and on and on. So my point was, Donald Trump, pay attention. You're not as invulnerable as you think you are. And Americans, you are not as invulnerable as you think you are. But nevertheless, if you're capital, you don't want to be caught in the middle of that conflict, because you don't know what's might happen. Regardless of my argument, Trump might send the military over next week. We don't know. It's too uncertain.
Yeah. I guess one of the other challenges we face is what American retaliation might look like, in this new positions of authority are going to have to be thinking about really carefully as we figure out our steps.
I agree, and I've had already some listeners or viewers who have sent me messages and say, "Stop talking about that stuff." You know, who knows what Trump watches? Don't inflame them anymore. Don't get them upset. And I have always taken the position that you have to stand up to bullies. You have to stand up to bullies, even if at the end of the day, and as a kid, and then I had tangled with a few bullies and got the odd black eye, and that's the price you pay for respect, because that's what it's all about with bullies. And I've seen this over and over again in my personal life. And when I was a young guy, I worked in laboring jobs to pay my way through university, and I saw bullies pick on younger, less able guys. And one day, Freddie took this guy out to the parking lot, and Freddie couldn't punch his way out of a paper bag, and he decked this guy, big football player, decked him, knocked him down, and the guy got up and said, "Okay, I can respect that," and that was the end of the bullying. But that's the price you pay. You take those chances, and you have to stand up for yourself, or you don't get respected, and then you just keep getting bullied. But you run the risk of getting a licking at the same time, because that's
Yeah.
the alternative. But nevertheless, I think on balance, you have to stand up, and you have to demand respect regardless.
Yeah, and I think there's a reasonable degree of consensus in Canada around that. And up to this point, the punishment for that will be economic. You know, um, if it ventures into punishment that's more than economic, that's going to be a real test of resolve for the country. And we're going to have to think about a lot of things that we haven't had to think about.
Yeah.
We've had the luxury of living in one of the most peaceful places and peaceful eras imaginable, and it's perhaps coming to an end.
On that sad note, Lisa, we'll end the interview. And I know how much this, clearly from this conversation and reading your Substack, I know how much it means to you emotionally. And American viewers, I can tell you, this is what Lisa and I are talking about. These are conversations that are taking place across Canada. I'm seeing 70-year-old men say, "I will bear arms if the tanks roll across the border." I mean, this is, of course, everybody can talk tough, but nevertheless, this gives you a sense of how deeply ruptured the relationship is. And a lot of people are saying, we're never going back. We'll never trust them again. Not in my lifetime, not this generation. That's how bad it is. Anyway, Lisa, thank you very much for this.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.